class and the shogun, who was in charge of Japan at any given moment for most of that history. So it's an art form that is very much shaped by this long history of patronage by warriors who had aspirations to become part of the old aristocratic culture that had kind of defined the age before them. So, what I'd like to do then is talk a little bit about the conventions of no theater and a little bit about the history, and then look more specifically at Sumidagawa or the Sumida River, which is the inspiration for Curlew River. This is an image from the early 20th century of a performance of the Sumida River. You can see in the hat the woman, the mad woman, and she is next to the prop that represents the grave mound in which the child actor is held. And we'll talk about the how that plot works in just a minute. Okay, the No Theater was came into its current form at the turn of the 15th century under the kind of with the vision of a playwright and performer named Zeami. And he not only performed and composed plays, but he also wrote treatises. So we actually know quite a bit about the early days of No in his hands. The No Theater, for those of you who are familiar with it, you will know that it's enormously slow paced. It is also linguistically quite complex, so that, modern Japanese audiences often will either read along on a libretto or have super titles at a theater so that they can follow along with the text. There's a lot of wordplay in it, and it's syntactically kind of complicated and not straightforward. So it's very hard to understand for a modern audience, and probably was for early modern audiences as well. So that Britten uses Latin, which is kind of familiar yet hard to understand or incomprehensible to 20th century audiences, kind of echoes the linguistic difference that would have been experienced by an audience of his time watching the No play, even if it was a Japanese audience. No is symbolic rather than realistic. Movements are kind of very vaguely indicative of what they are performing, so it's not at all like a modern play. And we'll see some of that in the little clip I'll show you later. The actors, the performers, the actors, the musicians, all of the personnel of No are traditionally men. They are trained traditionally from childhood to be No actors, and so there are lineages of performers that go from grandfather to, or from father to son to grandson to great grandson, and so actors start training when they're very, very young, often 3 or 4 years old. And there are a number of plays that have roles for small children, and Sumidagawa, the Sumida River, is one of those. No is famously a masked art. If actors performing roles that are kind of everyday living adult males generally do not wear masks, but pretty much every other role is performed by someone wearing a mask. So where female characters appear on the stage, like the madwoman, who is the main character of Sumidagawa, those actors are always masked. People who are actors performing gods or monsters or other supernatural creatures are also always masked in the No theater. So it's a very kind of it's an art form that is very different from contemporary theater. Um, Another thing that's kind of important about No is that the each of the there are role types that are specific to every No. There is always a main character called the shite, a secondary character called the Waki, and those two characters are kind of in opposition to or in cooperation with each other. And then there are very few other characters on stage, and they are always supporting either the main role or this secondary role. This is a shot of the no stage. As you can see, it's empty, and it's usually remains almost entirely devoid of props and certainly of any other kind of backdrop or scenery during a no play. So we are called upon to imagine the world that is created in the motions of the actors and in the words that are chanted or sung by those actors. You'll see to the left of the image here, there is a multicolored curtain hanging at the end of a bridgeway. That leads us back to what is essentially the green room. All of the actors enter through that curtain, go down the bridgeway, and then enter the stage. One other thing to note here is that there's a roof over the stage. Most stages today are inside, where it's easy to have performances regardless of the weather, but traditionally, No was performed outside, and this stage shape evokes what a traditional No stage would have looked like. There's a pine tree painted on the back of every No stage, and that is a kind of felicitous symbol, and it's meant to kind of evoke the fact that No originally was performed at temples and shrines with an intended audience of the gods of the temple or shrine. And it's also a kind of a felicitous sign for the longevity of the realm. So these are all kind of just conventions that we associate with the No stage. This image shows the opening of a different kind of play, but one that is very canonical in the No repertoire. This is a dream play, and dream plays always focus on a main character who is the ghost of a human being. Now this one, and this is a very most of the No plays that you are likely to see if you are in Japan follow a pretty formulaic storyline. And what we see here is the stage at the opening of the play Tadanori, which is about a very famous warrior who died in battle. We are to understand the setting as the place where he died. On the stage, we see arrayed across the back the musical ensemble that we always have with any No play. To our right, kneeling is a flute player, and then on stools are two drum players, and that's the ensemble that you have with every No play. And then arrayed along the right side or the left side of the stage, stage left, but to our right is a chorus. And every No play always has this set of musicians and a chorus. The chorus usually consists of about 8 people. No, about either 8 or 12 people. And it works a little like a Greek chorus in that it does help give us the setting and sometimes comment on the action, but it also often takes over for lines that are being sung by one of the characters, particularly if that character is going to do a dance or um, go into what would be a long monologue. That's often presented more like a dialogue between the chorus and the character. We see here to stage left the Waki, who is the secondary character. He is dressed as a priest. And usually in a very canonical play, the Waki, the secondary character, is a traveling priest. And basically the plot of the play goes like this. The priest arrives at a spot that is historically and poetically important. He encounters someone, in this case, this old man character that's walking down the bridgeway, who says he's the local from the area. The priest has a conversation with him and discovers that this local knows a lot about something important that happened at this particular place. The old man in this case reveals that he is actually the ghost of a famous person who died there. And that's the end of Act One. He leaves the stage, he comes back uh, in his full regalia as a warrior who died on the battlefield. And the priest then prays for the salvation of this ghost who is haunting this particular place. And at the end of the play, either the ghost is released from his attachment to this place and stops haunting it, or he continues to haunt it. And that's the basic plot for many, many no plays written by Zeami, this very famous founder of the no theater. Now, Sumidagawa is somewhat different from that. It was written by Zeami's son, Motomasa, who died under mysterious circumstances in 1432. He left a number of plays, but is most famous for this one, which has remained an important part of the no repertoire all through its history. Although, interestingly, the shoguns didn't like it performed in the shogunal palace because it was so sad and so kind of inauspicious in its message. Now, unlike the plays of Zeami, this play is a real-time no, in which the main character is not a ghost, but some other kind of living person. And in this case, of course, that's the mad woman. So instead of the ghost being the main character, the shite, here we have the mad woman being the shite. In this play, this madwoman main character is a nobleman who resides in the capital, which is referred to as Miyako, which means capital city. And that capital that she resides in is the city of Kyoto today, which was for a very long time Japan's capital city. She's been driven mad by the loss of her son, who was kidnapped by a slave trader. And she travels looking for her son. She travels very far to the other side of the realm, where she reaches the Sumida River and encounters a ferryman who is the secondary character. And he takes her across the Sumida River. And while he does, he recounts the story of a boy who died there exactly a year ago and who was buried on the other shore. And of course, she comes to the realization that this is her son. And the play ends with her praying in front of the grave mound where he is buried. His ghost appears, disappears, reappears, and then disappears completely. And through this final scene where she is praying for her son's repose and encountering the ghost, we have this kind of back and forth between the two of them, praying to Amida, the Buddha, who takes care of us after we die and takes us on to heaven. So it's a very kind of striking, moving, and very sad, kind of gut-wrenching play, which is one of the reasons it wasn't performed at the Shogunal Palace. Now you'll note here that the shite, the main character, is a living person, but nevertheless, we have a ghost appear, and we also have a similar kind of functioning between the main character and the secondary character, where the ferryman operates in certain respects like the priest, because he helps this main character get to a point where she can come to an end of her journey and theoretically put her troubles to rest. The mask here is the mask worn by the character or the actor who portrays the madwoman. And this is a mask called fukai. And it is meant to depict a woman of middle age who has suffered. I'm going to show you, put that in comparison to here on the left, we see another mask. This is a mask called Ko Omote, which is the mask of a beautiful young noblewoman. And the difference between this beautiful young noblewoman and the middle-aged woman who has suffered mask is that the older woman's face is more emaciated. Her mouth kind of reveals that she is more troubled. So by virtue of these masks, we know what kind of person the mad woman is, and we expect her to be someone who has faced sorrow in her life. Okay, just a little more about the play. This is a map of Japan to show you where she starts and where she goes. So the circle, the green circle is at Miyako, at present-day Kyoto, where her son would have been taken, and the star is at the Sumida River. And the Sumida River is runs through present-day Tokyo, but it also was in many ways a border between civilized Japan where at the time in the medieval period, the places where people lived and were kind of more settled and had good roads, and the kind of the outback, the hinterlands, where there were fewer people, where you were more likely to encounter other kinds of people who were more residents of the north and kind of drifted down into right at the border of where civilized Japan was. So this river itself is obviously a marker. Rivers are always kind of borders between one place and another, but this is a very kind of strong border in medieval Japan. So because she's traveled this far, she's really gotten to the very, very edge of civilization. And it's only by crossing this river that she is able to find where her son has been buried. So I'm going to just show you a series of slides of what the play looks like in performance on a conventional no stage today. The first thing that happens in a performance of Sumidagawa is that the prop representing the grave mound of the son is brought out and placed on the stage. And the little boy who performs the role of the son is hidden inside this. Next, we have the traveler encounter the ferryman on stage. And the ferryman and the traveler is a secondary character who wants to cross the river and says, "There's a mad woman coming behind me. You might want to wait for her." The ferryman waits for her. She appears. The ferryman goads her into performing for him. He wants to see her mad dance so that he will take her across the river. And at that point, this is the woman in her travel garb. And at that point, she sings of and evokes a poem that is very famous associated with the Sumida River. And I'll share that with us in just a minute. She is then allowed to board the boat and cross the river. In crossing the river, the ferryman tells her of the story of this boy who died and was buried exactly 1 year ago. She realizes it's his son. I'm sorry, her son. And then the ferryman urges her to go and pray in front of his grave. She does. And as she's praying, the boy, here she is being ferried across the river. And you'll note that there's nothing on the stage. There's just a ferryman with a pole, no boat, no river. We just are required to, we're asked to imagine that. And she crosses along with the traveler. She then prays for the repose of her son, and then this little boy comes on stage responding to her, and she grasps at him, but he always gets away. He hides back inside the grave mound. He emerges again, then disappears one more time. And we end with her prayer for his repose in the afterlife. So it's an extremely moving play that concludes with this mother not able to grasp the ghost of her son. Okay, just a little bit about the Sumida River. The Sumida River has a long poetic um, lineage in Japanese poetry and literature. And it really goes back to a famous poem that is attributed to a man named Ariwara no Narihira who lived in the 9th century. Now, he, according to kind of legend, and probably only according to legend, was exiled from the capital at Kyoto, and traveled to the east. And he traveled for days and days and days. And when he reached the Sumida River and wanted to cross it, he saw a bird, and it was a seagull, essentially, like the one we see here. And he asks the ferryman at the river, what is the name of that bird? And the ferryman tells him, well, that's a capital bird. That's a miyakodori. And then Ariwara no Narihira, who is a very famous poet, composes a poem about the this capital bird. And the poem in English goes, if you are true to the name you bear, there's one thing I would ask you, capital bird. The person I love, is she still or is she not? So is she still alive or is she no longer alive? So we have a long, and this is a poem that is evoked many, many times throughout the history between the 9th century and the time the play Sumidagawa was written. So when the woman arrives at the Sumida River, she says to the ferryman, "Hey, you should be thinking like the ferryman who encountered Ariwara no Narihira." And she writes a poem herself that is evocative of Narihira's. So we have this kind of entwining between the no play from the 15th century and this very old poem from the 9th century that kind of reminds us that there is a long history of associating the Sumida River with a sense of longing and loss and distance from the capital. And then just a few things that it might be interesting for us to think about as we prepare to see Curlew River, in light of the fact that we know that Benjamin Britten saw this play, that he was moved by this play, and that he then went on to compose this church parable of Curlew River, that actually bears striking resemblances to Sumidagawa well beyond the shared plot. One of the things that I think it's helpful to think about is how important the religious or ritual context is for both of these works. Sumidagawa is presented more or less as kind of a memorial service for this dead child that the mother kind of unwittingly stumbles upon on the date that is the anniversary of his death, and then she is able to perform this memorial. We also see Britain interested in using the idea of a river as a border between kind of the civilized world and the unknown that's beyond there. And of course, the bird as a marker of this place. But in addition to that, we also see that Britain is treating his individual characters similarly to the No, in that they are roles. We have the madwoman, we have the ferryman, which is really the way each of these is treated in the No as well. A woman doesn't have a name. The woman doesn't really have a backstory. She's just a type of person who has suffered in a particular way. Um, Another thing is the kind of small cast that we see in Curlew River that is very similar to that in the No. The small number of musicians and the kind of the pilgrims as a chorus, kind of serving very much as the chorus does in the No. And also something that I learned in other conversations about this, the about Curlew River, is that Britten gave the didn't necessarily want a conductor for the musical ensemble, but wanted there to be communication between the musicians and the actors, and among the musicians and among the actors, to allow for a certain amount of maybe improvisation isn't quite the right word, but kind of expansion or contraction of time that would then come together at specific beats within the parable. And that's somewhat similar to the way that the musicians and the actors come together in No. And there are differences, of course, but in No, basically all actors and musicians train independently, learn the movements of any given play and the musical patterns of any given play. And then and it's because it is very carefully structured and very, very kind of conventional in its performance technique. There's one way that any school performs Sumidagawa. So when actors and musicians come together for a performance, they only rehearse once usually, and they don't necessarily rehearse all of the play that they're going to perform. They kind of work on the parts where they might have problems, and then they perform the play once. And it's not something that happens in runs. It's kind of a coming together that is a one-time event. And that's in part evocative of its ritual roots. And I think probably one of the things that made Britten think about, could this be, what are the kind of ritual or religious and ritual contexts that might be appropriate in telling the story in in his own context. One last thing I wanted to share with you. This is the grave mound of the boy. And of course, this is an utterly fictional story. The basis for this play, this No play, is really the imagination of the playwright and the poetic tradition that makes the Sumida River an important poetic site. But along the shores of the Sumida River in Tokyo, you can visit the grave mound of this character, this fictional character from the No play. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'm going to ask Matthew to queue up a video. And this is just the last couple of minutes of the play where the woman is praying in front of the grave mound and the child appears. And I'd like you to see this because it is so moving to see the child on stage, and then we can talk about that when we get to the end. This is a performance that was done at basically a civic center. So it's a conventional, modern, any stage that can be used for anything, not just No. But there are posts on four corners that are used to kind of mark it off as if it were a No stage. So please don't be confused by that. Woman is praying for her son. Okay, Matthew. I'm sorry that was a little stop action. I will drop the link in the chat probably if I can figure out how to do that. Um and I've lost you. Just a sec. Um and if anybody wants to take a look, this is um a YouTube of basically the second half of the play. So if you're it's no performers famously don't like to have their performances recorded, so you can't find much online. But this is one half of the second half of the play. So if anybody's interested in that, you can take a look at that. Okay, I think I am done and ready to talk when you are.
Fantastic. I mean, that is such a deep dive into a world that is so different from anything any of us are familiar with. So thank you for really illuminating something that I think is completely fascinating. And it's sort of the perfect segue into my first question discussion point, which is Britain we think of as so inherently British. You know, everything he created was tied to his experience in Britain as a Brit, and then he goes to Japan in the 50s and witnesses Sumidagawa. And you know, you really touched on a lot of this, but how do you think he saw something without the information that we received from you today? How do you think he sat and witnessed Sumidagawa and created something truly Western facing out of something so deeply Eastern facing? You know, it's incredible having just seen that clip. Even music, you know, how I you just have to wonder how he drew the inspiration to create Curlew from this.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to speculate, but I do think that kind of visually, even if you don't understand what you're seeing or you don't understand the words, and the music is something that is very um, new to you, kind of the visually this clear suffering of this character, this mad woman character. And you probably know that this is a mad woman and she encounters the ghost of her son. And then this really striking image of this ghost of a child in the form of a child that you can't that she can't quite touch, um, is I think is very, it has to, that strikes a universal chord. But I think that also kind of the musically, it is kind of evocative of kind of a religious context that I imagine, that he could look back and think, we have something similar to that. And it does, I think that it's a little mesmerizing. Like, I don't, it's not even mesmerizing. It's auditorial,
I think it is. I
auditorially
found that very
pleasing.
mesmerizing. Yeah.
Just but sonically as well. And I think probably that was a motivation. But it's one of those stories that is it is universal, and I think probably in the 1950s for someone coming from Great Britain as a conscientious objector to the war, and a kind of
Pacifist, sure.
pacifist, and coming to Japan in the 1950s that was still in the process of rebuilding, that that this idea of the loss of children is something that would really resonate as well.
That's really, really amazing context. And musically, Britten has such a distinct style. So much of his vocal writing, obviously for Peter Pears, tenor, and but it goes so much further than just that. But to hear that really guttural, visceral outpouring of emotion coming from the no actors, I mean, it makes sense that it really impacted him
Mhm.
to do that. And then the child started. That
Mhm.
was really, really gripping
Mhm.
and brings about my next inquiry is the significance of the child in Sumidagawa. You know, for us in the Western canon, we do think of Madama Butterfly, Dolore in Puccini's Madama Butterfly. Um, Talk to us about the significance of the child throughout Sumidagawa.
Okay, it's striking in the same way, right? It just
Right.
it when you have a child on stage, it just does something that is very different from adults on stage. And a child and children in the no theater were used for. I mean, there are a couple of other stories. This is the best one, but there are a couple of other kind of stories of mothers looking for their lost children where you do have a child on stage. This is the only one in which there isn't a reunion in this life.
Mm,
But it's there. Motomasa, who wrote the play, felt very strongly that this child needed to have a voice and needed to appear on the stage to really hit home with the emotional impact. His father, Zayami, said, I think it would be more effective if you just kept the child off stage and never showed him. And so there was this kind of debate about whether, between father and son, about whether the child should appear on stage. But in the end, Motomasa's um, inclination to put the child on the stage because it actually allowed not simply auditory but also visual impact of the mother not able to grab at the child, is the way that it's been staged mostly ever since. So,
it's really, really fascinating. All of that insight into especially I think that's really interesting. The debate
mhm.
um, of, oh no, should be off, no, 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 should be on. And that's really what has drawn people to Sumidagawa and clearly Britain to it and producing Curlew, which is always from I can share and confidently from a an artistic producing standpoint, procuring a child to handle that much um context that is really, really difficult, both musically and dramatically, is the biggest challenge. So among a sea of challenges, it's a really quite a challenge to find a child who can handle that. So that certainly makes sense that it is really such a significant part of both Sumidagawa and Curlew. So
Yeah, and that's in the know, these actors traditionally are lineages, father to son to grandson, and this ends up being, it's an important training for
Sure, rite
every,
of passage.
but but it is also a kind of an enormously, it's very fraught for the child, I am
Mhm.
sure.
Yes,
But it's also, it also allows for this kind of expansion of the emotional impact by having a child on stage.
absolutely.
Sometimes children are not used in many roles, but they often are, well, when they are used, it's either to be a child or some other characters that are given particular reverence, like an emperor or a certain famous hero, are played by child actors to kind of emphasize their specialness or their or in as in this case, kind of their frailty, their need for protection that
Sure.
often can't be given.
Really, really interesting. Thank you so much for all of that insight. I open it up. We have time for, I think, just a few questions. Does anybody have a question? Feel free to unmute. Janet, go ahead.
Thank you. It was fascinating. Just one, I didn't read enough. Yesterday I intended to, and I got too busy for other things. But I do notice that Britten calls these parable for church performance, and it's a triad, and the other two are biblical stories. I guess one of the things is the music sounds so um, European. It sounds like Gregorian chant, I know, plain song, and it was intended to be performed in a church. I don't even know exactly what my question is, but it's just a comment that of the three of them, he takes this one of them's totally different than the other two. He takes a Japanese story, a well-known story, and sort of anglicizes it. It just seems, I don't know, I don't know if he wrote anything or whatever. It just is an interesting thing that he did. And then I'll just make a comment. I'm still a little worried that the audience won't won't appreciate it as much if they don't have a little bit of this background. And that's just a comment. I feel like I heard you yesterday, Dr. Euler, and I was just blown away. I just wish everybody in the audience, though, had this background to sort of understand the parable, the Japanese, Britain. I don't know. It's an amazing thing that he did. And I hope all of us can appreciate it because it's different.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that Curlew River, perhaps more than some no plays, can stand on its own in part because it is within this idiom that is kind of familiar and yet hard because it is so historically distant from us. Um, but yeah, this is always, as a scholar of no, this is a huge struggle because contemporary Japanese audiences can't really get all the layers of no either. But the hopefully the stories also stand on their own. But I do think that if you're able to take the time and learn a little bit about the background, that the layers there make it even more interesting for sure.
Matthew, in that same light, I know this is being recorded. Can we make this online and publicize it through any of our many broadcasts to the opera from the opera?
Well, I am recording it and we will certainly work on it's actually as Janet, you were saying that, I was thinking we recorded this and if
That's
there are people who need, this access, we will certainly work on sharing it with them so that as many people that would like this incredible background can have it.
great. Thank you.
Matthew, I feel so much better prepared, and I've read a little bit of things that you and others put online, and that's really great. We all know Logan is an amazing young tenor, but I was wondering from you or Elizabeth, that style of singing, does that have a certain term for it? It's sort of chant-like, but is there a certain term for what that would be called?
Specifically the no actors singing.
Yes. the Mad Woman.
I certainly defer to Elizabeth.
Well, in the no, okay, so no chanting or no is fairly conventional, and it follows a certain set of patterns. So you have and things move at different paces, and there's also kind of more variation. Some of it is essentially called song, and some of it is speech, and some of it is kind of chant that's in between. And in any no play, there's usually a general movement between, if you have you start out with spoken word and then you move into chant, and it's really really complicated, but it's fairly conventional. So the articulation of a no play, like plain song, kind of follows a certain set of patterns, and you have expectations, and you have a specific range and a specific kind of move from one tone to another that sounds very formulaic and ritual and religious, or at least religiously inflected in Japanese. That said, we don't have a traditional Japanese music notation. You're at whatever pitch you are, and we all kind of adjust to that, and we don't worry about being in tune in the same way that Western music would develop probably, around that time. So.
And I
Thanks.
would add to that in the Western facing tradition. Obviously, we all know there is more notation and I would say specificity behind a lot of that. But at the root of all of this is the oral tradition of call, respond, and just how powerful that very simple notion is, and how it can inform so many different kinds of vocal traditions, as we've just witnessed a new one, this no tradition. And so I think Britain hearing that is sort of the perfect mind to have transformed it into a Western style of we hear Gregorian chant, but then we also hear Britain's own stamp of vocal writing, which is really, really iconic, distinguishable, harmonically interesting. Often the range is broad, really, really interesting rhythmically. That is often what set Britain apart. And his really, really, in my opinion, the best text setting of the English language belongs to Britain. So it's really fascinating to combine the two traditions into what you'll hear in Curlew.
Thanks.
Kumiko, do you have a
Yeah,
question?
Logan said that he's not going to wear a mask or nothing. And he has a male face. He has the a little bit how the audience will understand. This character is a female,
Hmm.
and because he's coming as totally his normal face, only different. Uh, he maybe have the red robe compared with another guy has black robes. That's the only difference. But he's do they understand? Probably quite a long time. Audience will not understand. Oh, this is the mother, maybe father.
Hmm.
Like
I think that, and I am not entirely aware of any costume or makeup enhancements that might assist with that illusion.
no makeup tomorrow. The Logan has completely no face, no nothing.
Right.
Facial.
So I think it will really rely on the strength of the relationships in the drama, in how the story is told. And there is the Madwoman specifically, as we saw in the No, and as we've learned, has such a specific sort of air and introduction. So I think that in our specific production, it will be clear in not in a physical way, but in a dramatic way of who the Madwoman is, if that makes sense.
And I think I'd also, if we think about Britain, so Britain goes to Japan and he sees this thing that he doesn't really know much about. And although he's seeing a female face and female clothing, he's hearing this
Tenor.
voice that is clearly male. And in this context where the audience understands that that's still a woman, right? This is a character of a mother. This is a character that is like kind of deeply gendered as the mother of this child, the one who has given birth to this child, and that is why she is so distraught in a way that we don't have, at least in the Japanese tradition, in the No tradition, you don't have mad men, you have mad women who are driven mad by like this loss of a child. So I think he probably, and this is utter speculation, but that may be something that worked with his, I want to write for a tenor. And this is a context in which we know like men performed in parables. Like these are monks as a group performing. Um so he's asking us to take that same leap of faith that he was asked to take when he saw the No, to understand this as a performance. And he does, it's very clear, it's a play within a play, that nevertheless, even though this is a bunch of monks performing, it still can tell this story of these other characters. That's what I'm thinking about with this. I'm not sure I'm right.
Do they going to have the translation? I mean, English, sung in English, but do they going to have the in
We
the
will
church? Do they going to have that?
we will
Nothing?
not. No, there is a detailed synopsis page in the program that we encourage people to sort of reference during the performance, as there are pretty clear scene distinctions throughout Curlew. I would strongly encourage that route of just looking at the synopsis page in the program ahead of time, but then also referencing as the piece is being performed, because it'll be a very helpful sort of marker of the drama. But I love that what you were saying, Elizabeth, that sort of suspense of the buy-in of audience to any sort of drama, right? Ultimately, you are given a piece, words, music, and it is up to the interpretation of the director and the performers to really sell exactly what has been assigned to them. So I have every confidence in we have a fantastic group of resident artists. Both the director, Dana Kinney, is a resident artist, and all of the performers are either current or recent graduates of the resident artist program. Janet, yes,
Well, I just
absolutely.
one more comment about the music. So, Dr. Oyler, you told us that in No, they typically don't even practice together, and in fact, it sounds like by design they don't have a conductor. I know that in the current production they decided to have a conductor because otherwise. I don't know. I just thought that was interesting. And yesterday there was an example of a part where the monks are singing, and I think she called it heteropolyphony or whatever, but they actually are singing the same thing, but in different times. And I'm just saying, here's my ignorance. If I hadn't known that, I might wonder if they don't. What's the problem that they're not singing together when they're kind of processing? Again, it just strikes me that that my ignorance will be a blockage to appreciating this, and maybe that's true for other audience members. So it was just a comment that this idea that their music is actually kind of different. It's not harmonized and together. It's actually kind of an individual, seems like at times.
Yeah, I was really struck listening to yesterday, talking about the kind of curlew marks, which there are moments when you come back to where somebody is in charge, and that's where we land and then we move forward. And that really, I mean, no works that way to, yes, it's very formulaic. The music is very formulaic. So, you learn the piece, the order in which each of these, pieces goes together. and then you can perform it because you've learned all these pieces and you have them in your mind, which is you can't, it's different when it's one Britten opera slash church parable and these musicians are asked to do things that are more complicated. But I do think that kind of expansion and contraction of time or of sound is something that he must have found interesting in the know, because that happens in the know, that there are beats when you come back together and there are moments when you're keyed on one person rather than another. And that must just have been something that he found interesting to play with. But yeah, it's really helpful to know that. I agree. The more that you learn, the more you get out of it, for sure.
Excellent, excellent points. And Britten was so specific in how he wrote, and the heterophony and the aleatoric, which is that sort of random. It sounds that way, but it is very well put together, constructed, and rehearsed. And the effect, I would actually compare this to taking in a Wagner opera for the first time. There's often just these streams of music, and you're just sort of lost in this soundscape. But then out of all of that comes this very specific anchor point back to a certain a leitmotif, a theme, an idea. And Curlew River is just another example, another soundscape of that idea, I would say. And as an audience member, um, I think having performing the church parable in a church offers this reverent space to just sort of take in what you're witnessing, and maybe it isn't entirely clear, but you're resigning to the fact that it's going somewhere, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Do you have any other questions? Well, thank you so very much, Elizabeth. This has been really such an incredible pleasure to have access to someone who is so entrenched in this art form and has such insight and expertise. I think all of us can say this just makes witnessing the performance even more exciting.
It's going to be great. We are so lucky to have Curlew River here. I am so grateful to Pittsburgh Opera for bringing it's just an incredible and unique piece to us. And I'm also very grateful for the opportunity to talk a little bit about the no that inspired it. I agree. It makes it gives you just one more layer
What exactly? Right. Right. And for a project that, in Christopher Hahn's final season, something he's wanted to do for so long to finally come to the surface, come have the stars align, so to say, it's really quite exciting. So thank you so much for being a part of this. And thank you to everyone for attending. I actually see Mr. Prendergast is attending, and he will be doing an in-person lecture a week from today. Is that correct, Ryan?
Yes, I believe that time is now 12:30 at Calvary next Sunday.
Fantastic. Great. And I won't spoil too much, but I hope all of this group will come to part two next week, and hopefully we don't have any snow getting in the way. But thank you so much, Elizabeth, and to everyone for being here. And hopefully everyone enjoys the rest of their Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks
Thanks,
very much.
Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.